koutou katoa no mai, haere mai. Good evening, welcome. Thank you for coming on this quite a nice evening. You could probably be doing some gardening or something more productive, but I'm very happy you're here. So as I was just introduced, I'm a student at Massey University, and this lecture explores some aspects of my doctoral thesis. It also draws on an article I recently wrote for the Wesley Historical Society. There's a great deal I could tell you about flax, but in the interest of time and in an attempt to stay focused on the topic at hand, I will just give a very brief introduction on the plant itself. The New Zealand flax trade was primarily focused on one cultivar of flax, Phormium tenax, also known as harakehe, or simply New Zealand flax. But there's a shocking plot twist. New Zealand flax is in fact not a flax at all. It's actually a lily. And it is for this reason that Dr. Yates at Massey College became one of the leading expert researchers on flax, as he was already an expert on lilies. His extensive lily gardens at Massey were later joined by a large flax plantation. The flax trade is an industry that has been overlooked concerning its significant role in the building of New Zealand, from a traditional Māori industry to an industrialised 20th century business. As the industry grew, so did industrial relations. A union was formed with political influence and a particular commitment to pacifism. As I have studied this industry and its industrial relations, the contribution of Christian pacifism and the Māori peace movement have become more evident and offers a rich tapestry of ideological influences that formed a unique trade union that in itself had its own influence on the New Zealand labour movement. The New Zealand flax trade was centred in the Manawatu and was a pivotal industry in this country's history. It had an economic continuity that spanned from traditional Māori life into 20th century commerce. Flax had traditionally been dressed by Māori, who had processed the raw flax into fibre by stripping it with shells. While this got the job done, it was uneconomical for commercial production purposes due to how labour-intensive it was. Te Raupraha was able to fund his munitions requirements by selling dressed flax to Sydney. This was made possible by the large number of slaves he had preparing flax. Pākehā found a way to mechanise and later industrialise this process, which saw the flourishing of an enormous industry. During the industry's history in this district, at some point there were some 300 flax mills that straddled the Manawatu River. The largest mill was at Shannon, and at its peak employed 500 men. The use of flax was wide-reaching in New Zealand society and internationally. The industry endured as late as the 1970s, and flax fibre was used for a range of products, some of which you still may have in your homes today. If you have a very old wool fadge in the garden shed, or an old copper hot water cylinder, or if you or your grandmother still have an old Axminster carpet in the sitting room, you may possess a piece of flax history. In addition to general cordage and twine, it was used for wool packs, insulation for hot water systems, carpet backing and underlay, and it makes a very good weed mat if you can get your hands on some of this old felt. It was a boom-bust industry and mainly succeeded when there was an international shortage of similar hemp fibres. For example, the shortage of fibre as a result of the American Civil War and the Spanish-American War saw flax meet the demand. Another example is the invention of the combine harvester in the United States in the early 20th century, that saw the demand for cordage that could only be met with the assistance of New Zealand flax fibre. With industry came a trade union, and one with political might that produced notable politicians across the divide. The Flax Industries Trade Union in this part of the country was formerly known as the Manawatu Flax Mills Employees Industrial Unions of Workers, which for your interest and mine I will just refer to as the Flax Union from now on. One example of the power of this union was their prevention of the introduction of a mechanised form of harvesting flax. For most of the industry's operation, the entire clump of flax was cut with a pruning hook, as I will demonstrate. Without hurting myself. Probably should have put more thought into this. So the original method cut the entire plant off like so. So it looks something like that. Now, when you cut the flax like that, it took 4 to 5 years for it to regrow. So that was how they would manage their harvesting. The only obstacle for an industrialised version of harvesting the flax was because of the trade union who would not let it happen. And Dr. Yates commented that it would have been very easily for a machine to be developed that would harvest the flax in this way. The only obstacle was that the union wouldn't allow it to happen. And while we're on the topic of harvesting method, I can also show you how harvesting changed, if you're interested. The industry was hit during 2 seasons, I think 1908 and 1920, by the yellow leaf disease that decimated the flax crop. Despite lots of research, a cure was not found, but it was discovered if the crop was harvested differently, a higher yield could be achieved. This was done through the side leafing method. In which the outer leaves were cut and the middle 3 prongs remained. This meant that with the regrowth, it took harvesting from every 4 to 5 years to every year that the plant was able to be harvested. And the increase in the yield as a result of this was up to 90%. This is also the traditional way that Māori harvested flax before Pākehā thought they knew better. As noted, the flax trade, most of which operated outside of the Manawatu, operated within the Manawatu, as an industrialised industry, developed a large, powerful and for a period militant trade union at the beginning of the 20th century. It was not unusual for the period, and unions were formed wherever men were at work. Notable politicians emerged from the industry. These included Tom Shand, the Minister of Labour under the Holyoake government, the first Labour Prime Minister, Michael Joseph Savage, who was a Manawatu flax cutter in his early years in New Zealand, and Tim Armstrong, Minister of Labour under Savage. Shand's role as Minister of Labour in that national government should not be underestimated, particularly given his success in largely preserving industrial relations structures at the time when Keith Holyoake had promised to disestablish them in the 1960 general election. Likewise, Tim Armstrong should be acknowledged as the Minister of Labour who introduced a standardised minimum wage and the 40-hour work week. While there are sensational anecdotes that no doubt you've heard about stunts pulled by the union in its militant period, such as the train carrying Massey's Cossacks that was intercepted on their way to the Wellington strike in 1913 that was then, I think the train was filled with sewage, are well known. But what has been of particular interest to my research is the Union's commitment to pacifism and the interwoven influence of Christian pacifists in the Māori peace movement. Flax workers accounted for almost a quarter of the military defaulters during the Great War. And one of the most famous of these flax working trade unionists, and for a brief time a Palmerston North local, was Mark Briggs. Briggs was taken to the Western Front and experienced Field Punishment No. 1 alongside Archibald Baxter. Field Punishment No. 1 is where a person is subjected to various forms of brutality and included him being tied to a post in no man's land. But what caused this union to be so unusually committed to the cause of peace? To understand this, we need to look at the ideological influences on the union itself. The low-hanging fruit of such ideologies is socialism, and of that there is no question on the unions at the time, particularly in the flax mills of Tokomaru, which were the most militant. The famous American socialist, integral to the establishment of the New Zealand Socialist Party, Robert Reeves Lamont, was resident in Shannon in the early 20th century. Shannon was also the epicentre of flax production in the Manawatu and a hotbed for radical thought. A group of politically active Russians who immigrated to Palmerston North in 1908 were also influential in the Union at the time. One of the early political successes of the Union was the election of a flax worker, John Robertson, to Parliament on the original New Zealand Labour Party ticket, the precursor to the New Zealand Labour Party that was in place from 1910 to 1912, for the Otaki seat in 1911. The Union even hosted controversial suffragette Adelia Pankhurst, who was the co-founder of the Australian Communist Party. There appears to have been two interrelated vehicles of influence on the Union that contributed to the high number of workers embracing conscientious objection. These influences were the Māori peace movement and Christian pacifism. In particular, the influence of Anglican and Methodist clergy was notable. Historically, the earliest examples of the Anglican Methodist influences on the peace movement were Octavius Hadfield and his mission at Otaki and Johann Riemenschneider at Waiwera. When Octavius Hadfield arrived in 1839, he found himself in the heartland of Māori flax production. As noted earlier, Te Rauparaha exported flax to Sydney to purchase muskets and ammunition for his military conquests across New Zealand. Christianity seemed to be easily accepted by Māori in this part of the country, who themselves had requested a missionary. Hadfield's initial objective, however, was to preach peace, rather than the traditional missionary approach of civilising and converting. His commitment to peace is also evident in his opposition to the invasion of the Waikato in the 1860s and other anti-colonial sentiments. Te Rauparaha may not have become a man of faith in his lifetime, but he did become a man of peace. And the church at Rangiatea that Hadfield and Te Rauparaha built was a testament to the peace that was established. Another significant missionary influence on peace in the 19th century was that of Johann Riemenschneider. While a Lutheran, he was licensed by the Wesleyans and operated his mission from Waiwera in Taranaki. The prophets Te Whiti Rongomai and Tohu became spiritual pupils of Riemenschneider, who, along with the general principles of Christianity, educated them with a particular focus on peace or pacifist ideas as they had been popularised by philosophers in Riemenschneider's native Germany. During the Taranaki War, Riemenschneider was the intermediary between Māori and the colonial government. Te Whiti and Tohu were recognised early in their lives for the significance they would hold spiritually, and Te Whiti was predicted to be a great spiritual leader and teacher. And this was well before their introduction to Christianity. and why there is wide speculation as to who first introduced the Bible to Te Whiti, as it may have been a freed Ngāpuhi slave who preached in the district before Riemann Schneider's arrival. Te Whiti and Tohu went on to establish the peaceful Māori Parihaka settlement in the mid-1860s, a remarkable example of pacifism and non-violent resistance that inspired international leaders such as Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. Paul Monin noted that in the 1870s, young Māori men increasingly transitioned to wage labour, including the flax industry, and that flax cutting paid more than many could make farming their own land. The flax trade had a large number of Māori workers and Māori trade unionists. Māori played an active role in union activities. As the industry strepped from Otaki to Taranaki, bookended by the peaceful commitment of Tamihana Te Rauparaha in the south and Parihaka in the north, the commitment of many Māori in these districts to the Māori peace movement should not be underestimated when considering their influence on the pacifist commitment of the flax workers and the trade union. Little is written about the Māori contribution to trade union activity, aside from some detailed work about shearers and freezing workers in the east coast of the North Island. Murray et al. Noted that the role of Māori in union activity was one of the most significant gaps in New Zealand labour history. In 1916, the New Zealand government introduced conscription for military service in the Great War. Political figures who had emerged from the Manawatu Flax Union and active flax trade unions were vocal and active in their opposition. Tim Armstrong, who had been a flax worker and was later an MP and Minister of Labour, was imprisoned for 12 months for sedition. Michael Joseph Savage, who became the first Labour Prime Minister, spoke publicly in his opposition to subscription. Mark Briggs, who has been noted, a Manawatu flax worker, was sent to the front lines as punishment for his refusal to serve. The Union during the Great War also harboured a German national, Fritz Maraquet, who was able to evade internment throughout the duration of the war. The Union actively campaigned against subscription, and some flax workers identified themselves as pacifists by wearing a white feather, the symbol of Parihaka. A key figure towards the end of the war years was Methodist minister Moses Aitken, who held executive roles in the Social Democratic and Labour parties and had staunchly opposed conscription in 1916. He ran a study group for trade unionists in the flax industry. While a more widespread commitment to pacifism among Methodists developed after the Great War, Aitken was among few Methodists who criticised the Church's support of the war. Another Methodist minister with a circuit in the district was Percy Paris, deeply committed to Christian pacifism, social justice and the labour movement. Paris would make a particular contribution to the labour movement in the years of his editorship of the New Zealand Methodist Times. Now, in these days, the Methodist Church was more than harmless fun for old people. The New Zealand Methodist Times was considered one of the most radical publications under his editorship, and for a time was considered more radical than the Māori Land Worker. He later went on to be the president of the Methodist Church, and pacifist commitment within the Union grew in the post-war years. As what's seen with some of these churchmen who have been mentioned, as was noted with some trade unionists, was a fashion where some left the Anglican Church as a way to reject imperialism and became Methodists as a way that they felt was more palatable for their political views. While the ideals of Christian pacifism influenced the Union's ideological formation, it did not necessarily translate into the personal spirituality of the flax workers. They were poor church attenders, and certainly some flax workers were suspicious of those peddling religion. An expert on the flax industry, the late Ian Matheson, who for some time was the Palmerston North City archivist, amassed some 300 archive boxes of material on the flax trade that have been invaluable to my research. But part of the issue of some of Matheson's contributions is not necessarily his archival work, but some of the conclusions he made around religion. Given that the flax workers were not great churchgoers, he tended to put aside any religious influence, particularly on the trade union. One story is that someone trying to preach to the preach to the flax workers that the flax workers didn't appreciate, they locked him in a cage and hoisted him above the river and left him there, and thought that might teach him a lesson. Another person some of you might be familiar with is a chap called Ormond Burton. He was New Zealand's leading pacifist in the Second World War, and a lot has been written about his life. Burton served as a stretcher bearer and a soldier in Gallipoli and in France, and was decorated by both the British and French. He supported the Great War initially as a just war, but after the signing of the Treaty of Versailles and some further thought, he became a pacifist in the 1920s. Burton also was a Methodist, and for a time became the minister in charge of the Webb Street congregation, and conducted a ministry there with alcoholics and those at the fringe of society. He employed a former Manawatu flax worker and trade unionist to work at Webb Street, named Frederick Marden. Marden mainly worked as a caretaker for the church and the grounds, but at the same time, while he was there, Burton and his contemporary A.C. Barrington founded the Christian Pacifist Society in 1936. And Webb Street Methodist became a centre of pacifist organisation during the Second World War. Burton was imprisoned several times, twice at Mount Crawford, and was finally sentenced to a longer period at Napier Prison. When he was first arrested, he was bailed out by the Prime Minister, Peter Fraser, and Burton pleaded with Fraser to abandon the conscription and New Zealand's commitment to the war. A number of his parishioners suffered similar fates and were imprisoned, and Burton was then expelled from the Methodist Church, and the Webb Street Church was closed. One of the registered conscientious objectors from that congregation whom Burton defended in court was Marden's son Ronald. And while little paperwork exists about these relationships, it's interesting that the flax union that had held so much commitment to pacifism, particularly following the First World War, then went on to influence one of the key movers and shakers of pacifism in the Second World War. Key figures from the flax industry and trade union who themselves were strongly committed to the principles of peace went on to form the first Labour government, as has been noted, such as Tim Armstrong, Michael Joseph Savage, Mark Briggs, who served on the Legislative Council. This government included pacifists who were not connected to the flax industry, including Bob Semple and Peter Fraser, who were imprisoned during the Great War. Walter Nash, as an Anglican, was also considered himself to be a Christian pacifist. Despite these commitments to pacifist ideals, however, in the Great War, the first Labour government enforced some of the harshest restrictions on pacifists during the Second World War, when compared to similar Commonwealth countries like Australia and Canada. However, it's very important to note that this approach did not come from the former flax trade unionists. Semple was even responsible for designing a tank during the war effort. Savage died early in the war before conscription was introduced. Armstrong bitterly fought in Cabinet against conscription before his death in 1942, and Briggs, who Labour had appointed to the Legislative Council, was the only parliamentarian to vote against conscription. And it was these draconian regulations that saw pacifists such as Burton and Barrington imprisoned. Later, pacifists were moved to other institutions, including military camps and purpose-built work camps. This is for several reasons. While Burton was receiving a lengthy prison sentence. Many who were prosecuted could only be imprisoned for 3 months. And these pacifists were often troublesome for prison staff as they insisted on prison regulations being followed by the book, which they often weren't at that time. Some pacifists were non-compliant and riled up other prisoners into riots. The long-term plan came to build camps for the pacifists across the country. 2 of these labour camps were built in Shannon, and these were among the largest in the countries that imprisoned some 250 conscientious objectors. Notable New Zealanders who were detained there included Terence Baxter, the son of Archibald Baxter, who had been noticed, and the brother of James K. Baxter. Dan Long, who later went on to head the Government Workers' Union, the Public Service Association, and Rex Hillary, the brother of Sir Edmund Hillary, were all imprisoned in this camp. These prisoners were put to work in the district's flax swamps. Some of these pacifists found this to be such difficult work, they begged that they could go back to prison. It's ironic that some of those of the labour movement who had been such great pacifists in the Great War formed a government that sent the pacifists of the next generation to serve in the swamps that had produced so many pacifists as a punishment for their commitment to peace. And what is remarkable, as has been noted, is that the pacifists from the Flax Union remained committed to their principles when their contemporaries went the other way, which speaks to the depths of their conviction. Later in life, Burton wrote biographies about those who had inspired him in pacifism, which included Octavius Hadfield and Percy Paris. So to conclude, the flax trade has been overlooked in many of its contributions that it made to New Zealand's history and commerce, the economy as a domestic and export product, as well as its role in the development of industrial relations. The influence of the Māori peace movement and Christian pacifists on union activities and the industry has also been underestimated, and the broader influence on this trade union in forming the first Labour government. The relationship between clergy and the direction of the union, and the later involvement of a former flax worker and trade unionist in Burton's World War II pacifist activities, has also been overlooked. The World War I pacifists of the first Labour government, as I noted, were not as accommodating of the next generation and put them to work in the flax swamps of the Manawatu. But those who had emerged from the flax trade remained committed right to the end. And this is an important but largely forgotten part of New Zealand's industrial, labour and pacifist history. Thank you for your attention.